Why was the mess hall so quiet? At midday, it was never like this. Forks usually clattered against metal trays, boots echoed across the concrete floor, and laughter bounced between the walls. But on that afternoon, silence crept in like a fog. Soldiers sat rigid at their tables, eyes darting toward the center of the room, watching something they didn't dare stop. She stood there, Captain Elena Ramirez, her uniform sharp, her posture unbending, her eyes steady even under the weight of the man towering over her. Colonel Douglas Harrington, 25 years of service, medals across his chest like armor, a reputation carved from brilliance and from fear. His voice alone could silence a room. His temper could suffocate it. And today his temper snapped. "You think you can question me in front of my men?" His voice thundered, vibrating through the metal trays. His face flushed red, a vein at his temple pulsing with rage. Elena's voice was measured, even soft, but steady. "I wasn't questioning you, sir. I was clarifying a directive, the safety of our team." "Don't you dare correct me." Spit flew from his mouth, his words a lash across the air. "You'll follow orders, not interpret them." Around the room, soldiers dropped their eyes to their food. A few glanced at one another nervously. Some clenched their jaws, caught between loyalty and discomfort. Everyone knew the colonel's wrath. Everyone knew silence was survival. But Elena had never been raised to bow to silence. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, sharp and steady. "If you watch injustice and say nothing, you are part of it, even in uniform, even beneath the weight of rank." There were lines that should never be crossed. Her chest rose with a deep breath. Her heart hammered in her ribs, but she forced her voice calm. "With respect, Colonel, this directive puts the unit at unnecessary risk. I am obligated to bring that to your attention." And then the room stopped breathing. To Harrington, her words were no objection. They were a challenge. A woman standing tall against him in front of his men, his authority mocked, his pride insulted. What he did next was unthinkable. In one swift, violent motion, Harrington seized her arm, his grip bruising. He yanked her toward the latrine door at the edge of the mess hall. Before she or anyone could process what was happening, he shoved her head down. The cold porcelain pressed against her forehead, and then water, still, icy, metallic with disinfectant, over her face, over her breath. Gasps cracked through the silence. A spoon dropped to the floor. Someone muttered, "Jesus Christ." But no one moved, no one dared. Harrington hauled her back up, water streaming down her hair, soaking her collar, clinging to her skin. She coughed, blinking away the sting in her eyes. His lips curled in a sneer. "Next time," he growled, his voice low, venomous, "you'll remember your place." And then he let her go. She stumbled back against the wall, drenched, humiliated. Every eye in the room locked on her, but no one moved. The colonel barked a final order, "Back to your meals, show over." Then he marched out, his boots heavy, his pride restored. Silence lingered like smoke after fire. Soldiers stared at their trays, their hands frozen. A sergeant opened his mouth, thought better of it, and shut it again. The fear was suffocating. Harrington's influence reached far beyond the mess hall. A complaint could end a career before it began. And yet, Elena didn't cry. She didn't collapse. Water dripped down her hair in steady beats onto the floor, but her spine straightened like steel. Her jaw locked tight. Her eyes, unyielding, burned into the space Harrington had left behind. She would not give him what he wanted. He wanted to see her broken. He would not. And so, dripping, humiliated but unbroken, she walked out, each step deliberate, each echo of her boots louder than the last. Soldiers watched her pass, some in shame, some in awe, and others with quiet admiration they couldn't show. That night in her quarters, silence pressed heavy against her chest. She stripped off her soaked uniform and sat on her bunk. The memory replayed like a cruel film reel, the sneer on his lips, the gasps around her, the cold shock of the water. Shame tried to dig its claws into her, but she refused to let it take hold. Instead, she reached for her notebook. Her hands trembled as she opened it, but her handwriting was sharp, deliberate, pressing so hard the ink bled into the page. She wrote everything. The time, the place, his words, the witnesses, every detail. Each word she pressed into the paper was an anchor, a record, a shield. By the time she closed the notebook, humiliation had turned into something else. Resolve. He had tried to silence her with degradation. Instead, he had given her a mission. The next morning, whispers followed her. Soldiers looked away when she passed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. She sat alone at breakfast, the empty seats around her an invisible fence. Some avoided her out of fear. Others avoided her because they couldn't bear to face what had happened. Later in the operations office, the silence deepened. Lieutenant Parker froze when she entered. Sergeant Dorsey busied himself with fake paperwork. She could almost hear their unspoken words. Don't get involved. Don't risk your career. The silence cut deeper than the water, deeper than the colonel's hand. His act had lasted seconds, but the complicity around her, the refusal to speak, the fear that smothered truth, that was 1,000 small cuts. That evening in the briefing room, Harrington presided over the table like nothing had happened. He gave orders with calm authority. When his eyes slid across Elena, he deliberately dropped her rank. Elena, you'll oversee the supply chain review tomorrow. Try not to misinterpret directives this time. Laughter rippled around the table. Not genuine, not loud, but enough to sting, enough to remind her she was alone. Her jaw locked, she said nothing. In that room, silence was survival. But in her quarters, the silence became something else. A forge. She opened her notebook and wrote it all down, the deliberate omission of her rank, the forced laughter, the colonel's smug tone. Every word, every gesture. Facts over feelings, records over rage. Still, loneliness pressed down. At times, she stared at the blank wall and wondered if she was losing her mind, if she was fighting a war she couldn't win. But then she remembered, the water rushing over her face, the colonel's hand crushing her arm, the sneer on his lips. And she knew. She wasn't imagining, she wasn't exaggerating. She had been humiliated, stripped of dignity, assaulted in front of her peers, and if she stayed silent, she would be complicit in her own erasure. Her silence would be fatal. So she chose differently. She would endure the whispers, the avoidance, the empty seats. She would endure the isolation, and she would turn it into fuel. Every night she wrote. Every day she carried herself like steel. Harrington thought he had crushed her. Instead, he had awakened her. She wasn't broken. She was preparing. And when the time came, she would be ready. Why did no one sit with her anymore? The mess hall buzzed with clinking trays and scattered chatter, but around her the air was different. At breakfast, every table seemed full, except the one where Captain Elena Ramirez sat alone. Forks scraped plates. Boots shuffled. Conversations darted nervously, but when eyes brushed against her, they quickly fell back to coffee mugs or half-eaten eggs. The story had traveled faster than truth. By dawn, the base already knew. The colonel had shoved Captain Ramirez's head into a toilet. Some retold it with crude exaggeration. Others softened the details, but the heart of it was the same. She had been humiliated, in front of everyone. And now the silence confirmed it. Once junior officers had sought her table, eager to learn from her fairness, her discipline, her ability to keep calm under fire. Now they sat in clusters far away, their bodies angled like walls to keep her out. They weren't cruel, not openly. They were afraid of being seen beside her, afraid of the colonel's wrath. Elena lifted her coffee, forcing her hand steady, and took a sip she couldn't taste. Her stomach churned, not from the food, but from the invisible barrier closing in around her. She chewed slowly, each bite like sand in her mouth. Later that morning, she walked into the operations office. Lieutenant Parker, usually quick with a joke, stiffened when she entered. He bent over his paperwork as if it suddenly demanded his full attention. Sergeant Dorsey, mid-conversation a second before, dropped his voice and shuffled papers noisily. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't meant to be. Elena stood there for a moment, taking in the silence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The message was already clear. Don't get involved. Don't risk your career. Don't stand too close to the woman the colonel had chosen to crush. That evening's briefing only drove the knife deeper. Harrington sat at the head of the table, radiating authority. When Elena entered, the room stiffened. A few glanced up, then quickly down. Harrington's eyes flicked past her, cold, dismissive. "Elena," he said smoothly, pointedly stripping away her rank. "You'll handle the supply chain review tomorrow. Try not to misinterpret directives this time." A ripple of laughter slid across the table. Not loud, not warm, but sharp, forced, carried on the air like static. Her chest tightened, but she didn't move. She didn't rise to it. Her jaw clenched so hard it hurt, but she said nothing. In that room, silence was survival. But alone in her quarters, silence became something else. She sat on her bunk, notebook open on her lap, pen in hand. The blank page stared at her like a challenge. She recorded it all, the deliberate omission of her rank, the laughter, the colonel's tone. She wrote Parker's frozen stare, Dorsey's fake shuffling, the way soldiers' shoulders stiffened when she entered the room. Every detail mattered. Every word preserved was armor. If she didn't record it, Harrington's version of reality would one day replace hers. He would call it discipline. He would call it a misunderstanding. And without proof, he would win. But she had proof. Her words. Still, the weight pressed down. Loneliness wrapped around her like a cold blanket. There were moments she stared at the wall and wondered if she was crazy. Was she making too much of it? Was she ruining her career for pride? Would speaking out only destroy her? Then one morning, a voice cut through that fog. "Ma'am." She turned. Corporal Jenkins stood in the shadows outside the barracks, shifting nervously. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching. His voice dropped to a whisper. "For what it's worth, I saw what happened. I wish I had done something." His eyes carried guilt, shame, fear. Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to thank him. She wanted to grasp the humanity of those words and hold it close. But she also knew the risk he was taking even by speaking to her. "I understand, Jenkins," she said softly. "Don't compromise yourself." He nodded quickly, retreating with brisk steps, as though distance could erase the moment. But his words stayed. One soldier had chosen to break the silence, even for a heartbeat, and that heartbeat mattered. That night she opened her notebook again. She added Jenkins's words. She underlined them. They gave her a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Still, the days dragged heavy. Harrington worked quietly, strategically. Promotions discussed without her name. Assignments shifted away from her oversight. Meetings where her suggestions dissolved into silence. Punishment cloaked as routine. And yet the more he tightened the screws, the more she felt her resolve sharpen. His public humiliation had been unforgettable. Now, the quiet retaliation was its own kind of confession. A pattern, a picture forming. So she kept writing. Every night the pen moved. Every line was a promise to herself: he will not bury this. But doubt still crept in during the dark hours. Sometimes she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight pressing down on her chest. Maybe they're right. Maybe no one will believe me. He has rank. He has connections. He has power. Her eyes would drift to the notebook on the desk. She would open it, flip through the pages, and there it was, the truth in her own hand, not distorted, not erased, real. One night as she closed the notebook, she looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her desk. Hair damp from the shower, eyes red with exhaustion, and she remembered the colonel's hand, the cold water, the sneer. A fire lit inside her. No, she wasn't overreacting. No, she wasn't imagining. She had been assaulted, humiliated, stripped of dignity in front of witnesses. Silence might protect him, but her silence would destroy her. From that night on, she made a choice. She would endure the whispers, the empty seats, the cold shoulders. She would let the weight press down, not as a burden, but as a forge. Every day she survived it, she grew stronger. Every page she filled with ink, she built her case. The base could pretend nothing happened, but Elena knew the truth. And one day she promised herself, everyone else would know it too. That promise was tested sooner than she expected. On a rare weekend leave, she drove into the nearest town, a small cafe off the highway. She wanted quiet, a few hours where the base's silence couldn't reach her. But on the way, her eyes caught a headline in a newsstand window. Whispers of abuse at local military base. Sources speak of colonel's misconduct. Her breath stopped. She bought the paper, her hands trembling. In the corner booth of the cafe, she unfolded it. The story didn't mention names, but the details were unmistakable. A senior officer accused of humiliating a subordinate. Retaliation against those who questioned him. A culture of silence choking the base. Her throat tightened. She hadn't spoken to any journalist. She had told no one but Torres, her old mentor, and Jenkins. Could one of them have leaked it, or had her careful notes already reached ears beyond her control? It didn't matter. The truth was leaking. The silence was cracking. Back at the base, tension was palpable. Soldiers walked straighter, eyes sharper. Conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Suspicion curled through the air like smoke. Who had spoken? Who could be trusted? And Harrington, though still striding through the halls with practiced authority, looked different now. Elena noticed it. The slight clench of his jaw when he passed a group of whispering soldiers. The flicker of annoyance when he saw reporters at the gate. The chain of command scrambled to contain it. Internal matter, baseless rumors, detrimental to morale. Warnings spread. Any soldier caught speaking to the press would face severe consequences. But the harder they tried to clamp down, the more the whispers grew. Elena felt the shift, small, subtle, but real. The shield around Harrington was cracking. That night back in her quarters, she found a folded note slipped under her door. 4 words. "We believe you, stay strong." Her chest tightened. She didn't know who had written it. She didn't need to. For the first time since the humiliation, she didn't feel entirely alone. Why did the base feel different that morning? The drills sounded the same, boots pounding the dirt, rifles clattering at the range, orders barked in sharp rhythm. But beneath it all there was something else, a hum of unease, whispers trailing off when footsteps approached, eyes darting quicker, shoulders stiffening tighter. Elena noticed it the moment she stepped outside her quarters. Something had shifted, something she couldn't yet name. The answer came hours later, when the investigators arrived. 2 of them, civilians in plain suits, carrying thin folders and clipped authority. They walked the halls with quiet confidence, eyes sharp, pens ready. Their presence was impossible to ignore. They weren't part of the chain of command. They weren't under Harrington's control, and that made them dangerous. Soldiers stiffened when approached, answers clipped and cautious. But beneath the discipline, fear lingered. Everyone knew what they were here for. When Elena's name was called, she walked into the windowless interview room with her head high. A table, 2 chairs, a recorder blinking red. Her hands folded in front of her, her notebook beside her, closed but heavy. She told them everything. The mess hall, the words, the humiliation, the retaliation that followed, the silence of her peers. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She told it plain the way it happened. Facts sharp as glass. The investigators listened, pens scratching, their faces unreadable. When she finished, the room fell silent for a long moment. Finally, one of them, a woman with steady eyes, spoke. "Captain Ramirez, you understand the risks of making these statements." "Yes," Elena said firmly, "but I also understand the risks of silence." Her words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Word of her testimony spread quickly, though no one admitted speaking of it. Those loyal to Harrington whispered that she was exaggerating, that she was emotional, that she was trying to destroy a decorated officer's career. Their whispers were sharp, meant to cut, meant to isolate. But others, quiet, cautious, began to waver. The investigators' presence cracked something inside them, the shield of Harrington's invincibility. For the first time, it seemed possible to imagine telling the truth. That evening, in the mess hall, Lieutenant Parker slid into the seat across from Elena. His eyes darted nervously around the room, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm ready." She frowned. Ready for what? "To tell the truth." His jaw tightened. "I saw what he did to you. I've been sick with it ever since. I'll talk to the investigators." Her breath caught. For weeks, she had carried the weight almost alone. Now, one of the men who had witnessed it was stepping forward. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. He nodded once, eyes steady. "I should have done it the day it happened. Better late than never." The next day, Parker gave his testimony. And a week later, 2 more soldiers followed. Each voice strengthened the case. Each statement chipped away at the wall Harrington had built around himself, and with each crack his temper frayed. He still strutted through the halls, barking orders with practiced confidence. But Elena noticed the shift. His laughter at briefings rang hollow. His eyes flickered with irritation when whispers broke out in corners. Behind closed doors, his voice snapped sharper, his temper spilling. One afternoon, she overheard him snapping at a fellow officer. "Do you think a few cowards are going to ruin me? I built this base." The words were venom, but they carried something else too: fear. Outside the gates, the media storm grew. Articles surfaced with bolder headlines. Anonymous sources describing a pattern of intimidation, retaliation, abuse disguised as discipline. Commentators asked hard questions about military culture, about silence, about rank and fear. Inside the base, division deepened. Some still muttered that Elena was a troublemaker, a disgrace to the uniform. But others, they watched her walking to and from her quarters, head high, shoulders squared, even under the weight of hostility. And in their silence, some began to admire her. One night, Elena returned to her room to find another note slipped under her door. 4 words again. "We believe you, stay strong." Her chest tightened as she read it over and over. She didn't know who wrote it. She didn't need to. It burned like a torch in the dark. And still Harrington fought. Denial came first. At an emergency meeting, he leaned back in his chair, metals gleaming, his voice calm but sharp. "These rumors are baseless. Fabrications designed to undermine this unit. A soldier who cannot handle discipline has twisted events to suit her narrative. I will not let weakness destroy what we've built." Some nodded, others stayed silent, but the unease in the room was undeniable. Next came the smear campaign. Whispered doubts spreading through trusted confidants. She was unstable, overly ambitious, bitter after being passed over for promotion, clever enough to play the victim, dangerous enough to ruin men's careers. The whispers spread like smoke, curling into corners, seeping into barracks. But Elena anticipated it. When investigators asked her about the rumors, she answered calmly. "They'll say I'm emotional, they'll say I'm ambitious, but facts don't lie. What happened in that mess hall was not discipline, it was degradation." The investigators nodded, pens moving across notepads. The smear was noted. Retaliation again. Still, Harrington's public image held for a while. Cameras caught him outside the gates, standing tall, expression resolute. "I have dedicated my life to this country," he said firmly. "These allegations are false. This is a personal attack designed to smear my record. I will not allow it to distract from our mission." On television, he looked every bit the decorated officer he claimed to be. Proud, disciplined, unwavering. His words resonated with some, those who valued loyalty above all else. But inside the base, soldiers saw what the cameras couldn't. They saw the way his temper flared in private, The way he demanded loyalty pledges from subordinates. The way he lashed out when reports didn't go his way. His armor was cracking. One evening, Sergeant Torres overheard two privates whispering in the barracks. If he's innocent, why's he trying so hard to shut everyone up? The other answered quietly, because he knows he's guilty. Rumors of his temper only fed the frenzy outside. Articles questioned whether his public calm was a mask. Commentators debated whether rank had allowed him to thrive unchecked. His lawyers begged him to stay quiet, but silence wasn't in his nature. He doubled down. "This is the new reality," he scoffed to a reporter. "A man raises his voice and suddenly it's abuse, discipline mistaken for humiliation. If this continues, the military will collapse under softness." Some applauded his defiance. Others saw only arrogance, a man blind to his own cruelty. And Elena. She refused to take the bait. She declined interviews. When pressed for comment, she simply said, "The truth will speak for itself." Her restraint contrasted his bluster, and slowly it began to shift opinion. Even the investigators noticed. One of them, Agent Calloway, remarked to her partner, "Every time he opens his mouth, he shows us who he is." The tide was turning. But victory was still far away. Harrington still had connections, still had rank, still had power. And as the weeks stretched, the battle shifted from humiliation and silence to something larger. This was no longer about one officer and one colonel. This was about a culture. A question bigger than the base. How many silences had been buried before hers? Why did courage always begin as a whisper? Lieutenant Parker had spoken, Corporal Jenkins had followed, and now the air on the base felt different. The silence that had once isolated Elena was shifting, cracking like ice under pressure. What had been a single voice was slowly becoming an echo and then a chorus. But with each new voice, the danger sharpened. The first night Corporal Jenkins admitted he would back her if needed, Elena lay awake long after lights out, staring at the ceiling. She thought of his fear, the tremor in his voice, the risk he was taking. And she realized something. Courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about walking straight into it. The next morning, Jenkins kept his distance in public, but when he passed her in the corridor, his eyes flicked up just long enough to meet hers. No words, no gesture, just acknowledgement. It was enough. And then something extraordinary began. A sergeant, long loyal to Harrington, quietly requested an interview with the investigators. His voice was low, his hands shaking as he spoke, but his testimony matched Elena's. Not only about the toilet incident, but about a pattern, public shamming, retaliation, intimidation dressed up as discipline. Each new account was like a brick removed from Harrington's fortress. Slowly, his walls weakened. But Harrington felt it too. He began summoning subordinates into his office, demanding loyalty pledges. His words dripped with threat. "Remember who you serve. Choose wisely who you align with." His eyes pierced through them, daring anyone to waver. Fear still held sway. Many nodded, many swore loyalty, but cracks had formed. Because some soldiers had seen something they couldn't unsee, Elena, dripping and humiliated, refusing to break. The image haunted them. Some tried to bury it. Others quietly couldn't. And courage, once lit, spread faster than fear. One by one, witnesses came forward, first quietly, then steadily. They spoke of the mess hall, of Harrington's retaliation, of the subtle ways he punished anyone who got too close to Elena. They described not just one incident, but a culture. The investigators listened, their folders thickening, their eyes sharper. By the second week of interviews, the base was transformed. Soldiers who had once avoided Elena now gave her small nods in passing. A folded note under her door. A whispered "stay strong" in the hallway. A quick squeeze of her shoulder from a young private before disappearing down the barracks corridor. It was subtle, fragile, but it was real. The media caught wind too. Reports grew bolder. Colonel's leadership under scrutiny. Pattern of abuse alleged. Commentators debated on evening panels. Some dismissed the claims as exaggeration. Others demanded accountability. Harrington's calm facade began to fray. His briefings turned sharper, his temper shorter. He barked at aides for minor mistakes. His laughter, once booming, now rang hollow. Behind closed doors, his frustration simmered. One night, Elena overheard him snapping at another officer. "Do you think a few cowards are going to ruin me? I built this base. They wouldn't dare." But they were daring. And the more he insisted on his invincibility, the more the cracks showed. The investigators worked methodically, cross-checking every statement, every note. Elena's notebook became a cornerstone. Her entries, meticulous, precise, relentless, aligned with the witnesses' testimonies. Each page of ink carried weight. Each detail chipped away at Harrington's defense. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Late at night, she sat at her desk, notebook open, asking herself the same questions over and over. Will they listen? Will this matter? Or will it be buried like so many stories before? Her pen hovered, uncertain. That's when Agent Calloway, one of the investigators, called her into a private meeting. Elena sat down, her heart pounding. "Do you think they'll believe me?" Elena asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Calloway studied her, her eyes sharp but kind. "Captain Ramirez, your courage has already made a difference. Evidence doesn't lie. Harrington's power depends on silence. You've broken that silence. Now it's his credibility at risk, not yours." The weight of those words pressed into Elena's chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, not in victory, not yet, but in validation. And still, the fight grew harder. Harrington wasn't giving up. He doubled down, feeding whispers to anyone who would listen. Elena was unstable, emotional, dangerous, a threat to the unit's cohesion. His smear campaign spread like poison. Some soldiers repeated it without question. Others listened but stayed quiet. A few even looked at her with suspicion in their eyes, doubt planted like seeds. But the investigators saw it too. "Smear campaign noted," they wrote. "Another layer of retaliation documented." Elena didn't rise to it. When asked by journalists for comment, she gave only one answer: "The truth will speak for itself." Her restraint contrasted sharply with Harrington's defiance. He gave interviews, scoffing at political correctness gone mad, mocking the idea that raising his voice could be called abuse. Some applauded his defiance. Others saw only arrogance. The public grew divided, but inside the base, more soldiers began to shift. One evening, 5 officers, senior to Parker and Jenkins but junior to Harrington, requested a meeting with the investigators. Together, they presented their testimonies, accounts of humiliation, intimidation, retaliation. Their statements aligned, and suddenly the case was no longer one woman's word against a colonel's. It was a chorus, a mosaic of truth too consistent to ignore. When the investigators compiled their findings into a report, they handed Elena a copy. Thick, comprehensive, every testimony lined up with hers, every detail cross-checked. Harrington's denials documented, his smears recorded as evidence, his retaliation exposed in black and white. Elena sat in her quarters that night, report in her lap, notebook beside it. Her hands shook as she turned the pages. For months, she had carried the humiliation alone. For months, she had been surrounded by silence. Now, the silence was broken. She wrote one last line in her notebook that night. They came forward. "The silence has been broken. The spotlight is no longer on me. It is on the truth." For the first time in weeks, she slept without waking in the dark. But the battle wasn't over. Harrington still had rank, still had connections, still had allies who whispered loyalty into his ear. And yet something had shifted permanently. The base no longer looked at Elena with avoidance. Soldiers no longer pulled away in the mess hall. Some nodded respectfully. Some even smiled faintly, not out of pity, but admiration. The humiliation that had once defined her was transforming into something else. Proof. Proof that courage once sparked could spread. That even in the tightest silence, whispers could grow into a roar. How long can a man hold back a tide? Colonel Harrington had weathered storms before. Deployments, budget cuts, political scandals that nipped at his command but never pierced it. Each time he emerged untouched, as if he believed nothing could truly wound him. And maybe for a long time nothing could. But this storm was different. This storm had names, faces, dates, testimonies stacked like bricks against him. And still he tried to stand tall. He told himself the same words every morning in the mirror, medals gleaming across his chest. Never let them see you bleed. His voice was steady, but his jaw clenched tighter each day. At staff meetings, he leaned back in his chair, exuding calm authority, insisting the rumors were false. "These are fabrications," he declared, his voice measured, his expression carefully controlled. "A soldier who cannot handle discipline is twisting events into her narrative. Weakness will not undo this unit." Some nodded out of fear. Others stared at the table silent. The room was no longer bound by loyalty but by fracture, and Harrington could feel it. He pivoted to attack. Quietly he spread whispers about Elena. She was unstable, overly ambitious, bitter after being passed over for promotion. A woman who knew how to play the victim card. His words, planted in trusted ears, spread like wildfire through the ranks. At first it worked. Doubt clung to conversations in the mess hall. Some soldiers frowned when they looked at her. Some wondered, had she exaggerated? Had she twisted a confrontation into humiliation? But then the investigators compared testimonies. Parker's words matched Jenkins's. The sergeant's account matched Elena's notes, and the whispers began to falter under the weight of consistency. The smear campaign that had once felt sharp now sounded desperate. Elena felt it too. Each time she was asked about the rumors, she remained calm. "They'll say I'm emotional, they'll say I'm ambitious, but facts don't lie. What happened in that mess hall was not discipline, it was degradation." Her words were steady, her posture unyielding, and slowly the smear campaign lost its grip. But Harrington wasn't finished. He doubled down in public. Cameras caught him outside the base gates, standing tall, chin raised. "I have dedicated my life to serving this country," he declared. "These allegations are false. This is nothing but a personal attack meant to smear my record. I will not allow it to distract from the mission." On television screens, he looked like a war hero, decorated, steady, loyal. His voice resonated with viewers who had never seen his temper. His words struck chords with those who believed loyalty mattered more than truth. But inside the base, soldiers had seen the cracks. They had seen the temper. They had felt the fear. They whispered now, not in admiration but in suspicion. "If he's innocent, why is he fighting so hard to silence everyone?" The division grew sharper. His loyalists clung to him, whispering about betrayal and weakness. But the others, those who had once stayed silent, now looked at Elena differently. Not as a pariah, not as trouble, but as proof that someone could stand against him and live. One evening, as she sat writing in her notebook, Elena heard a knock at her door. It was Jenkins again, pale, nervous, but resolute. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I know I said I'd back you if it came to that, but I can't stay silent anymore. I saw everything. I'll tell the investigators." Elena froze, studying him. His eyes carried fear, but behind it determination. "Are you sure?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am, what he did was wrong." For the first time in weeks, Elena felt warmth spread through her chest. Not relief exactly, but something like it. She wasn't alone anymore. And courage, once sparked, spread. A week later, 2 more soldiers gave their testimonies, then 5 officers, then more. The investigators' folders thickened, filled with statements that aligned with hers, each one chipped away at Harrington's carefully constructed facade. And Harrington, cornered, grew erratic. He barked orders more harshly, criticized soldiers for minor mistakes, lashed out in meetings. His voice, once a symbol of authority, now sounded desperate, strained. Behind closed doors, his anger boiled, but behind his anger was fear. Late one night, Elena overheard him in his office, his voice a low growl. "They won't take this from me, not her, not anyone." But deep down, he knew. The tide was rising, and even the strongest walls cannot hold back a flood forever. Outside the base, the media storm intensified. Headlines demanded accountability. Articles questioned whether the military's culture of silence had allowed abuse to thrive unchecked. Commentators debated on national television, some defending him, others condemning him. For the first time, Elena realized her story was no longer hers alone. This wasn't about one humiliation, one officer, one colonel. This was about culture, silence, power unchecked. And she was at the center of it. It was a weight heavy enough to crush anyone, but she carried it the way she carried her notebook, firm, steady, deliberate. One evening, as she returned to her quarters, she found another note slipped under her door. "We believe you, stay strong." Her throat tightened as she read it again and again. She didn't know who wrote it. She didn't need to. She folded it carefully and slid it into her notebook, proof that she wasn't carrying this weight alone anymore. And that night, as she set down her pen, she whispered to herself, "This is bigger than me, and that means it matters." For Harrington, the fight was survival. For Elena, the fight was transformation. And in the quiet of her quarters, she realized something else. The tide wasn't just coming, it was already here. Why do walls always look strongest right before they crack? Harrington still walked the halls with his chest out, boots hitting the floor like thunder. He still barked orders in the same booming voice, still demanded silence when he entered a room. To an outsider, he looked unshaken, but those who had served under him long enough could see it, the stiffness in his jaw, the edge in his eyes. The colonel was bleeding, and everyone knew it. By now, the investigators' presence had become part of the rhythm of the base. Their plain suits stood out against fatigues, their notepads against rifles. They sat in rooms without windows, one soldier after another filing in, some pale with fear, others rigid with anger. And the pattern emerged. One voice had become two, two had become five, five had become 10, testimonies stacking higher and higher until even the most loyal officers struggled to dismiss them. Elena watched it happen quietly. She didn't gloat, she didn't strut. She walked the same halls she always had, her notebook tucked under her arm, her boots steady against the concrete. But she felt it. The air had shifted. Once soldiers looked at her with avoidance. Now they looked at her differently. Some offered faint nods, others brief eye contact that carried unspoken words, respect, admiration, gratitude. Still, she knew it wasn't over. Because Harrington was fighting harder than ever. Behind closed doors, he summoned trusted officers. "Remember who built this place," he snarled. "Remember who carried you here. You owe me. And if you betray me, I will make sure you regret it." Fear still worked on some, but others began to resist. Because once you've seen courage, fear doesn't hold as tightly. One evening, Elena returned to her quarters to find Parker waiting outside. His face was pale, his eyes determined. "I gave them everything," he said simply. She blinked. "Everything." He nodded, "Not just the mess hall, the retaliation, the looks, the way he stripped you of your rank in briefings. I told them all of it." Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but the words caught. Finally, she managed, "Thank you." Parker shook his head. "Don't thank me. I should have done it the day it happened." The next morning, 2 more officers testified, then 3, then 5. The ripple had become a wave, and Harrington felt it breaking. At briefings, his temper flared faster. He slammed his fist on the table when reports weren't to his liking. He snapped at aides, belittled soldiers for small mistakes, lashed out in ways he once hid behind closed doors. His mask was slipping. Whispers spread, he's losing it, he's scared, he knows it's over. But still, no one said it aloud. Until one day, 5 officers together requested a meeting with the investigators. They presented their testimonies as a group, a united front, accounts of humiliation, intimidation, and retaliation, each one aligned with Elena, each one tore at Harrington's facade. It was no longer her word against his. It was her word and theirs and theirs and theirs. A chorus of truth. That night, Elena sat at her desk, her notebook open. For months, her handwriting had been lonely ink on lonely pages, but now it was part of something larger. She flipped through the filled pages, every detail, every humiliation, every silence recorded, and she felt it, vindication. Not victory, not yet, but proof that silence was not absolute. Still, the weight pressed heavy. She had become a symbol now, whether she wanted to or not. Her story spread beyond the base, beyond the headlines. She was being spoken of in whispers she would never hear, in living rooms across the country, in debates on television. And with that came pressure. Late at night, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. "What if I fail?" she whispered. The reflection didn't answer. But the notebook did. Facts don't lie. She gripped it tighter, her anchor in the storm. Meanwhile, Harrington's defenses collapsed one by one. His denials rang hollow under cross-examination. His smear campaign documented as retaliation. His authority weakened as more witnesses stood tall. And finally, the moment came. An official report. The investigators handed it to her in silence. The folder was thick, heavy in her hands, every testimony inside, every detail she had written, every piece of evidence aligned. It was damning. Harrington's behavior exposed in black and white, his intimidation stripped bare, his power, once untouchable, documented as abuse. Elena sat in her quarters that night, the report open on her desk. She read slowly, page by page, her heart pounding. And when she finished, she closed her notebook one final time. She wrote just one line on the last page. "The silence is broken." The base, once suffocated by fear, felt different now. Soldiers who had avoided her now looked at her openly. Some saluted sharper than required. Some offered quiet words. One private whispered as she passed, "Thank you, ma'am." It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was real. For Harrington, the walls were closing in. For Elena, the walls were falling away. How does power collapse? With a bang or with silence? For weeks Harrington had fought, denials, smears, speeches delivered with medals gleaming, chin raised, eyes steady. He had tried to project invincibility, but the weight of testimony pressed harder with every passing day. The day the order came down, the base felt it before the words were spoken. The tension in the air was electric, humming through the barracks, the mess hall, the motor pool. Soldiers walked sharper, conversations cut shorter. Everyone knew something was coming. By noon, the announcement arrived. Colonel Harrington was relieved of command, effective immediately, pending further investigation and tribunal review. The news hit like thunder. Some cheered quietly, fists clenched at their sides. Others sat in stunned silence, struggling to process what once felt impossible. A few loyalists wore anger on their faces, muttering words like betrayal and witch hunt. But the tide had already shifted. The colonel who once commanded absolute loyalty was gone in a single line of official text. Elena heard the announcement alone, seated at her desk with her notebook open. The words spilled from the speaker, flat and final. For a long moment she didn't move. She just sat, staring at the ink on the page, her hand trembling slightly. It was over. Or at least this part was. That night the mess hall was louder than it had been in months. Laughter returned, nervous at first, then stronger. The weight of Harrington's presence was gone. Soldiers who had once sat in silence found their voices again. But Elena didn't join the laughter. She walked through the noise quietly, tray in hand, eyes steady. Heads turned toward her. Some nodded respectfully, some smiled. One young private whispered as she passed, "Thank you, ma'am." She offered only the faintest nod in return, not because she didn't feel the weight of his gratitude, but because she felt the weight of everything else. Victory didn't feel like triumph, it felt like exhaustion. Later that night, as she returned to her quarters, she found another note slipped under her door. "Because of you we spoke, because of you we were heard." Her hands shook as she read it. She pressed the paper to her chest, closing her eyes. It was never supposed to be about her. But somehow it was. The following week, the investigators expanded their report. Dozens of pages detailing not only the humiliation she endured but the system that allowed it. Retaliation unchecked, silence rewarded, fear weaponized. And journalists devoured it. Headlines screamed across screens. Colonel removed amid scandal. Voices of silence finally heard. Captain's notebook becomes case study in courage. Elena's name was no longer just a name. It was a symbol. For some, inspiration. For others, controversy. She never asked for either. But the weight was hers now. At the tribunal hearing, she was called to testify once more. The room was formal, sharp uniforms lined in rows, judges presiding at the front. Harrington sat across the aisle, stripped of command but still holding himself tall. His eyes burned into her as she took the stand. Her voice didn't waver. She told them what happened, the mess hall, the toilet, the laughter that followed, the silence that nearly crushed her. She told them about the retaliation, the intimidation, the whispers. She told them about the notebook, every page written not for revenge but for survival. When she finished, the room was silent. Harrington's lawyer pressed her, tried to twist her words, but the facts didn't bend. Too many voices had already aligned with hers. Too much truth had already surfaced. When the tribunal adjourned, Harrington rose slowly. For the first time, his posture faltered. Not much, just enough. A slight droop in his shoulders, a crack in the armor. And Elena realized something. Power doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, testimony by testimony, truth by truth, until even the strongest facade crumbles under the weight of silence broken. Back at the base, soldiers spoke more openly now. In the mess hall, conversations didn't halt when she walked in. In the corridors, nods weren't hidden. A sergeant stopped her one evening, his voice low but steady. "I should have spoken sooner," he admitted, "but you showed us it was possible." Elena nodded, words caught in her throat. She didn't need to answer. His expression said enough. And yet, victory remained bittersweet. For every soldier who now admired her, another still resented her. Whispers didn't vanish overnight. Some still called her ambitious, unstable, dangerous. Some still thought loyalty mattered more than truth. But the balance had shifted. The silence was broken. Late one evening, she sat at her desk, her notebook open to the last page. The words stared back at her. The silence is broken. She thought of the young private who whispered thanks, of Parker's trembling but steady testimony, of Jenkins, pale and nervous, finally stepping forward, of the note left under her door, "Because of you we spoke." She thought of Harrington too, once untouchable, now unraveling. His downfall wasn't her victory, it was simply the truth. And as she closed the notebook for the final time, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." Her story was not one of revenge, not of triumph. It was one of endurance, of carrying humiliation without breaking, of transforming silence into strength. And though she never asked for it, her story had become a mirror, a reminder that even in places built on discipline and fear, courage could still find a voice. Not with a bang, but with silence, broken at last. What does victory feel like when it was never what you wanted? Weeks passed after the tribunal, but the echoes of it lingered through every hallway, every briefing room, every quiet corner of the base. Harrington's name, once spoken with fear or reverence, now carried a different weight. Disgrace, removal, silence that could no longer be denied. And Elena carried on. She woke at the same hour, laced her boots with the same precision, walked the same halls she had before. Outwardly, nothing about her had changed, but everyone knew everything had. The mess hall was no longer a place of humiliation. When she walked in, conversations didn't falter in fear or awkwardness. Some greeted her openly now, others offered nods, a few even smiled. She nodded back, quiet, steady. She wasn't here for applause. She was here because she always had been. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the corridors quieted, she felt the weight of it. The notebook stacked neatly on her desk, every page filled, every line a reminder of what had been endured, what had been resisted, what had been broken. The silence. Her story had spread beyond the base now, beyond the military. Journalists wrote about her courage. Commentators debated her name. Some painted her as a hero, others as a problem. She had become a symbol whether she wanted it or not. And symbols carry burdens people never see. One evening she sat outside the barracks under a fading sky, the last light of dusk soft across the horizon. Parker sat beside her, silent at first. Finally, he spoke. "You know," he said quietly, "you didn't just change this base. You changed us." She shook her head. "I didn't change anyone. People chose to speak. That's what changed everything." He studied her. Maybe, but someone had to stand first. Someone had to show us it was possible. She didn't answer. She just watched the horizon darken, the stars beginning to pierce through. That night she wrote one final entry in her notebook. The truth was never mine alone. It belonged to all of us who carried silence like a weight, and now it belongs to those who will never carry it again. The next morning she placed the notebook in a drawer and closed it, not forgotten, but finished. The military would move forward. New commanders would come. New orders, new missions, new battles, but the mark had been left, a lesson carved into the culture of a place where silence once thrived. And she would carry the lesson differently, not as a scar, not as revenge, but as proof. Proof that dignity didn't need to shout, that sometimes the most powerful defiance was survival itself. Months later, she found herself standing in front of a group of recruits. They were young, fresh-faced, boots still stiff, eyes wide with the weight of uniforms not yet broken in. She wasn't here to lecture. She wasn't here to tell her story. She was here to train. But as she looked at them, she thought of what they didn't yet know, of the silences they might one day face, of the choices they might one day be forced to make. And she hoped quietly, fiercely, that they would remember something she never said aloud. That silence is heavy, that dignity is quiet, and that truth once spoken can move mountains. She didn't tell them her story. She simply taught them with patience, with steadiness, with a strength that didn't need to explain itself. And in that silence they learned. Later that evening, alone in her quarters, she sat by the window as the sun dipped low. The base was alive with noise, boots pounding in drill, shouts echoing across the field, engines roaring in the distance. Life went on. But inside she felt something else. Not triumph, not celebration. Peace. Because what mattered wasn't the headlines, or the tribunal, or the whispers of gratitude or resentment. What mattered was that the silence had been broken. And once silence breaks, it can never be restored in the same way. That night she wrote no more words. She simply closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and let the weight lift, just enough. The humiliation Harrington tried to bury her with had become something else entirely. It had become her strength, her resilience, her proof. And as the stars filled the sky outside her window, she knew one truth would outlast every headline, every debate, every whisper. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.